When Duke Theren Vale married Corusand Wren, the servants of Ashcombe Hall were told three things before the wedding breakfast had even gone cold. First, the ceremony had been small by design. Second, the new Duchess was not to receive callers until further notice. Third, the East Wing was to be prepared for her use and hers alone. The orders were given in Theren's own voice, calm as winter water, and because grief had sharpened him into a man whose quiet was more feared than another man's rage, no one dared question him aloud. Yet the house understood what had happened. A great duke had taken a wife from a family stained by scandal, then hidden her where portraits could not look offended by her presence. Society did not require explanation when cruelty came dressed in good breeding. It supplied one for itself and called the result common sense. Corusand heard the servants moving trunks along the east corridor while dusk pressed blue against the windows. She stood in the chamber that had been assigned to her, a beautiful room in the cold manner of expensive things chosen by people who did not intend to sleep in them. The bed hangings were ivory. The fire was small. The carpets were thick enough to silence every footstep she made, as though the room itself had been prepared to swallow evidence of her existence. She ought to have wept. Women in her position often did. Ruined daughters, compromised nieces, sisters of disgraced men. Society allowed them tears because tears made everyone else feel merciful. But Corusand had exhausted tears months ago, when her brother Lucian's gaming debts turned into whispers, and those whispers into allegations, and those allegations into the sort of scandal that did not stop at the guilty party. One man's recklessness became a family sickness. Her mother died before the worst of it. Her father retreated into apologies. Corusand remained, very much alive, to discover that innocence was rarely considered an urgent detail when a family name had become useful for mockery. Now she had been married to a man who had not looked fully at her during the ceremony. When Theren entered the chamber for the first and only time that night, he did not remove his gloves. "The East Wing is quiet," he said. "You will have privacy here." Privacy, Corusand thought, was a handsome word for exile. "I am grateful for your concern," she answered. He glanced toward the window rather than at her face. He was a tall man, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, carrying mourning not in black cloth alone, but in posture, in restraint, in the weary care with which he kept distance from any human warmth that might ask something of him. His first wife, Eleanor, had been dead just under a year. Everyone in Virginia knew he had loved her. Everyone also knew a duke with estates, tenants, and a childless household could not remain unmarried forever. The marriage to Corusand had been described in drawing rooms as practical. Society admired practicality most when it spared them the trouble of pity. "This arrangement," he said, choosing the word as if it had edges, "protects us both from unnecessary talk." There it was, not a marriage, an arrangement. "And from necessary talk?" she asked softly. For the first time, his gaze reached hers. It was not cruel, and that made it worse. Cruelty could be fought. This was something colder, an exhausted determination not to feel anything at all. "There is no need," he said, "for you to concern yourself with the house beyond what is comfortable. Mrs. Bell will attend to your needs. The staff have been instructed." "Instructed to forget I exist?" A flicker crossed his face, not shame, perhaps irritation that she had made the truth audible. "I have given you safety," he said, "and hidden me where no one must be reminded of the price of it." His jaw tightened. "You wanted this marriage as much as I did, I think," he said. No. She had wanted the creditors turned from her father's door, the remaining Wren lands preserved from opportunists, and her family spared another public degradation. Want had never entered it. But arguing that point with a grieving duke on the first night of a marriage neither of them desired felt beneath even the little dignity she still possessed. So she said only, "Then we understand each other perfectly, Your Grace." He bowed once, the gesture more correct than intimate, and left her alone with the crackle of the fire and the weight of a title that had changed nothing essential except the size of the cage. For 3 weeks, Corusand remained where she had been put. She took her meals in the east parlor. She walked in the walled herb garden at hours unlikely to coincide with callers. She read the small shelf of sermons, histories, and neglected poetry left in the chamber. On Sundays, she sat in the rear pew of the estate chapel while people pretended not to turn their heads. At first, she thought silence might be survivable if it remained clean. But silence in a great house is never empty. It fills with rumor. It learns the shape of doors. She heard the maids whisper that the Duke had been forced into the match by old family debt and newer social pressure. She heard a footman tell another that the new Duchess's brother had cheated widows at cards. She heard once a visiting lady remark in the corridor that at least His Grace had buried his disappointment in good architecture. Corusand did not answer any of it. She had spent too much of the last year learning that self-defense from a disgraced woman was often used as proof that disgrace suited her. What she did instead was begin to notice things. Ashcombe Hall was vast enough to hide carelessness in its corners. The estate books were not hers to read, yet need announces itself even where it is not invited. She saw it first in the kitchen accounts left half open by a distracted steward, flour reduced for the cottages at Briarfield, then in the laundress's cracked hands and apologetic mention that soap was being stretched this month. Then, in the face of a tenant child she glimpsed from the east garden gate, carrying a basket patched more times than woven. Once, when Mrs. Bell came to mend a torn sleeve, Corusand asked, "Has the harvest failed so badly?" The older housekeeper hesitated. Ashcombe Hall had trained its loyal servants not to trouble gentlewomen with the mechanics of hardship. "Not failed, Your Grace," she said, "but the winter was hard." Fever in the lower cottages. A barn roof gone at Westmere. Some rents deferred after the floods. "And the Hall has done what?" Mrs. Bell looked as if she had walked into a question with thorns. "His Grace has had many matters on him this year." That, Corusand understood, meant grief had narrowed the field of his attention until everything beyond endurance looked like interruption. She did not condemn him for that immediately. Grief makes tyrants of gentle people and statues of useful ones. But the result remained the same for those waiting below stairs and beyond the gardens. The next morning she asked for her own allowance account. The request startled the steward so thoroughly that he nearly dropped the key ring in his hand. Your allowance, Your Grace?" "Yes, unless the title is purely decorative." By noon, she knew the exact sum settled on her at marriage. By evening, she knew how much of it could be redirected without inviting notice from men who believed women spent money chiefly on ribbons and regret. She began quietly. Blankets sent through Mrs. Bell to the fever cottages with no sender named. Soap and vinegar purchased through the kitchen account and made to appear an ordinary household adjustment. 2 sacks of meal to a widow whose eldest son had broken his leg in the mill yard. Then, a physician's visit paid for in cash so that no embarrassed father need sign for debt in front of his children. She might have stopped there if gratitude had remained distant. But kindness, once witnessed in the face of someone who had expected none, becomes difficult to keep theoretical. So she asked to walk beyond the east garden. The first time Theren refused, he did so by sending a note. "The lanes are too wet, and there is no reason for your grace to discomfort yourself among cottages. Inform Mrs. Bell of any request you think necessary." Corusand stared at the message until laughter, sharp and humorless, escaped her. "No reason." She sent back a single line. If I am fit to bear your name, I am fit to use it where it may do some good. No answer came. The next day, however, a groom appeared to say a covered carriage would be made ready after dinner should Her Grace wish to inspect the tenant quarter. So she went. The first visit undid her. Not because the poverty was theatrical. It was not. Ashcombe tenants were not starving in the dramatic style of pamphlets meant to excite distant outrage. Their hardship was more ordinary, and therefore more insulting. Damp in walls that should have been repaired last season. Children coughing in rooms where peat had been saved too carefully. A woman sewing her husband's cuffs by window light because candles had become a luxury best postponed. A school primer passed between three families because paper cost more than pride would admit. And everywhere, when Corusand entered, the same startled expression. Confusion first, then alarm that their condition had been seen by someone from the hall, then disbelief that the Duchess meant to sit, listen, and ask practical questions instead of offering one polished phrase and retreating, before mud could threaten her hem. She returned 2 days later, then again the next week, then so often that the East Wing ceased to be the center of her life and became merely the place where she slept. By the end of the second month, she had reorganized the hall's linen rotation to free serviceable cloth for the cottages, without reducing household dignity in any way that mattered. By the third, she had persuaded the apothecary in the village to maintain a standing account for Ashcombe infants through winter. By the fourth, she had quietly begun a needle room on unused Tuesdays in the old dairy house, where tenant girls and widows could mend, stitch, and earn small wages from linens and shirts sold through a Richmond merchant who asked no unnecessary questions so long as payment was prompt. She did not do it out of saintliness. Saints are often people others prefer because saints do not resent the burden of being needed. Corusand resented plenty. She resented waste. She resented that the hall had enough silver to blind candlelight, and yet children below the North Ridge wore boots made of stubbornness and thread. More privately, she resented being treated as if her life had ended the day she married Theren. Useful work, she found, was the one rebellion no one recognized until it had already taken root. By spring, the tenants had stopped calling her Your Grace with frightened stiffness and begun saying it with something closer to trust. By early summer, their children waved at her carriage. A lame shepherd brought her the first lamb's wool from his flock because she had sent broth when his wife was delivered too early. Widow Hart sent jars of pear preserve. A carpenter repaired the gate at the east garden without charging the hall because, as he told Mrs. Bell, Her Grace sees folk. That is rarer than rank. News travels oddly through an estate. Nothing seems to move, until one day everyone already knows. Theren discovered the extent of Corusand's work 6 months into the marriage, and entirely by accident. He had ridden out after a boundary dispute at Westmere, impatient from heat and a sleepless night. The matter itself was trivial. 2 fence lines, 1 stubborn tenant, a steward too cautious to decide without ducal approval. He expected the day to end in mud, signatures, and silence. Instead, as he crossed Briar Field on the way back, a child ran out from a cottage yard with a posy of crushed summer flowers and shouted, "Tell the Duchess that Mother can stand again." Theren reined in sharply. The child froze, suddenly aware he had addressed the wrong authority. "The Duchess?" Theren asked. "Yes, sir." "For what reason would your mother send such a message?" The boy looked bewildered that a man who lived in the great house could fail to know what happened in it. "Because Her Grace sent broth and Mrs. Pike and the surgeon when the fever took Ma'am's strength," he said. "And because she said I was to tell if the swelling went down." 2 cottages later, an old man thanked him for allowing the dairy room wages to continue. 3 cottages after that, a woman curtsied and said the Duchess had promised fresh straw before the next storm. At the lane's end, Mrs. Bell's nephew, who worked the lower stables, mentioned with cheerful gratitude that Her Grace had convinced the hall to repair the Widow Barrett roof before the minister saw it and began a sermon about stewardship. Theren rode home with a strange pressure in his chest. Not anger, exactly. Something more humiliating. He had believed he was containing a problem. He discovered instead that while he mourned, the woman he had hidden away had quietly become the first person in months to bind the estate back into something resembling loyalty. He found her that evening in the old dairy house with her sleeves rolled and a ledger open on the table beside a basket of mending. Sunlight from the west window caught in loose strands of her dark auburn hair. 3 tenant women sat nearby, stitching shirts and arguing amiably over button thread. Corusand was listening to a girl of perhaps 12 read aloud from a primer, correcting her gently when she stumbled over a line about the Roman Republic. She looked up at Theron's entrance, and for one entirely disorienting moment, he saw not the scandal-ridden bride he had installed in the East Wing, but a woman so fully present in herself that the room seemed arranged around her without her asking it. The women rose at once. The child dropped into a curtsy, half from fear, half from habit. "You may continue," Theren said, though his voice came out rougher than intended. No one did. Corusand closed the ledger. "Your Grace," she said, "you are far from the West Hall." The tenant women looked scandalized by the sentence. Theren almost admired it. "I might say the same of you," he answered. A spark of something moved in her face. Tired amusement, perhaps. "I was under the impression I had obtained permission." He could have rebuked her. He might once have done so. Instead, he said, "Walk with me." They crossed the orchard in a silence alive with all the things he had not noticed for months. Children playing by the lower wall, repaired roofs silvering in the light, kitchen smoke rising from cottages that no longer looked abandoned to weather. Corusand waited with a composure that made excuses impossible. "At what point," he asked at last, "did my estate begin answering to you?" She did not flinch. "At the point, I think, when it became clear no one else was listening closely enough." The reply ought to have offended him. Instead, it landed with surgical accuracy. "I did not forbid charity," he said. "No," she answered. "You merely arranged things so that neglect could continue without your having to witness it." He stopped walking. There, among the apple trees and late sun, she met his gaze without deference and without insolence. It occurred to him with some force that he had never actually looked at her before. He had seen beauty, yes, and composure, and the inconvenient stain of her family name. But he had not looked long enough to discover the intelligence beneath her quiet, or the discipline beneath her grace. He had mistaken gentleness for fragility, because doing so had made indifference easier. "That is an unjust account," he said, though less firmly than he intended. "Is it?" He thought of Eleanor then. Eleanor laughing in the rose walk before fever took their child and then nearly took her mind, leaving him with months of helplessness and finally a grave. He had sworn, after her death, that no one would ever again breach the walls he built around the vulnerable parts of himself. Coruscant's arrival had felt like violation by circumstance, a second marriage pressed upon a man who had not finished being ruined by the first. So he had done what wounded, proud men often do. He had made coldness sound like order. But the estate around them bore witness against him. "Why did you do it?" he asked. She looked briefly toward the cottages below the ridge. "Because I know what it is to live in a house where one man's shame darkens every room," she said. "Because I would not spend my life being hidden as though scandal were catching. And because grief does not warm children, Your Grace." The words should have drawn blood. Instead, they opened something. He said more quietly, "My wife died last year." "I know." I was not prepared to marry again. No. That no contained more mercy than he deserved. And yet you punished me for it, she said after a moment. Not by law, not by cruelty people could point to, but by making me live as a tolerated embarrassment in my own marriage. The orchard held still around them. He had no elegant defense. So Theren Vale, Duke of Ashcombe, who had faced creditors, magistrates, war talk, and death without once lowering his head, said the rarest thing rank can teach a man. You are right. Coruscant's expression changed so slightly, another man might have missed it. The guard in her loosened, not fully, but enough to reveal surprise beneath control. I did not expect that, she admitted. Neither did I. After that, change did not arrive like lightning. It came by increments, which is the only honest way two guarded people begin to alter one another's lives. Theren moved her rooms from the east wing to the south apartments overlooking the Rose Terrace. He began taking supper with her privately, rather than sending formal apologies from the study. He listened when she spoke of tenant needs and asked for the estate accounts to be brought where she could review them with him. Once, after watching her argue down an overpriced grain contract with the Richmond factor, he laughed, a brief, astonished sound, as if amusement had caught him unprepared. You enjoy frightening men who think women cannot count, he observed. I enjoy correcting expensive misconceptions, she said. He looked at her over the candlelight then, with a warmth she felt like a hand held near flame. Admiration is dangerous when one has been starved of it. Affection, when it began, was worse. Theren noticed the steadiness of her hands when others panicked. Coruscant noticed that beneath his reserve lived a man who listened fiercely once he allowed himself to hear. He began accompanying her on visits to the cottages. At first, the tenants watched him with suspicion so polite it almost passed for loyalty. Then they saw him kneel to inspect a leak himself, remain through a fever night at the mill house, and sell 2 carriage horses to finance drainage works Corusand had recommended in the spring. Their marriage, so coldly begun, started acquiring private habits.
Shared tea before chapel, marginal notes passed across ledgers, quiet walks after dusk where neither spoke much, because both had learned that companionship need not always perform itself aloud.
The first time he touched her, as though she were cherished rather than merely present, was in the library after a storm. She had been standing on the ladder, reaching for a county survey, when the hem of her dress caught. Theren steadied her by the waist, and then, once she was safely on the floor, did not remove his hands at once. Corusand looked up. He looked as though the moment had surprised him into honesty. I do not know, he said, voice low, when this ceased to be duty. Perhaps, she answered, pulse unsteady beneath calm, when we both began choosing it. He kissed her then with an almost painful gentleness, as if asking a question he feared to phrase badly. The answer she gave was not in words. If the story had belonged to sentiment alone, that might have been enough. But happiness in high society is an invitation to inquiry, and inquiry from envious people becomes appetite very quickly. Lady Seraphine Morcant returned from Williamsburg just as Ashcombe began to look almost peaceful. She was 30, beautiful in the severe, polished fashion that made other women feel underdressed in their own skin, and had once been widely expected to marry Theren after Eleanor's death. Her brother held influence with 2 magistrates. Her mother hosted the kind of dinners where reputations were carved and served in courses. Seraphine had not forgiven being disappointed. When she visited Ashcombe, she embraced Corusand with exquisite correctness and said all the things malicious women say when they have no wish to be quoted accurately. My dear Duchess, how wonderfully settled you look. Country air performs miracles where society has been unkind. Corusand smiled. And city air preserves certain talents indefinitely, Lady Seraphine. The older women nearby pretended not to hear the blade hidden in the silk. Within a fortnight, the whispers began. Not coarse slander at first. Seraphine was more accomplished than that. She preferred the kind of poison that entered respectable conversation as concern. Had not Coruscant's brother once altered a note of credit? Had not her father entertained men of questionable solvency? Were the tenant charities at Ashcombe truly generosity, or merely a clever attempt to purchase affection after an inconvenient marriage? And was it really wise, for the Duke to trust estate papers where Wren hands might reach them? One rumor claimed a silver communion flagon had gone missing after Coruscant's visit to the chapel's stores. Another suggested the dairy room wages were funded from land sold improperly from dower acreage. None of it held together as fact. That was not the point. Society has never required its lies to be coherent, only useful. Theren wanted to crush the gossip openly. "Name the source and I will end it," he said one evening, pacing the study with a fury so controlled it chilled the lamp flame itself. Corusand, seated at the desk with 3 anonymous notes before her, shook her head. "You will not end it," she said. "You will only teach them the slander found its mark." He stopped. "They attack my wife. They attack the woman they think can still be isolated by her past." She lifted one of the notes between 2 fingers. "If I hide now, Seraphine wins without needing proof. You should not have to endure this." "No," Corusand said, "but I know how." That was the cruel truth. He was furious because the insult was new to him. She was dangerous because it was not new to her. The guidance that saved them came from his aunt, Lady Honora Vale, who arrived at Ashcombe with 2 trunks, 1 lapdog, and the kind of authority that made grown politicians behave like corrected schoolboys. Honora had been widowed young, outlived 3 seasons of scandal by refusing to die of any of them, and now regarded most social warfare as a tedious but occasionally useful form of exercise. She read the anonymous notes at breakfast, buttered her toast, and said, "How dull." Seraphine always mistakes elegance for originality. Theren stared. "You are certain it is she?" "My dear nephew, when a woman wishes to imply theft, ingratitude, and compromised blood in the same paragraph, one recognizes the embroidery." She turned to Corusand. "The question is not whether Lady Morcant means you harm. She does. The question is whether we force her into the open before or after she overreaches." "After," Corusand said at once. Honora's brows rose. "Good. I was afraid marriage to a duke might have made you cautious in all the wrong places." Together they laid a trap, built not from melodrama but from patience. Corusand continued her visits openly. She hosted a sewing afternoon for the magistrates' wives. She invited a minister's sister to inspect the new infirmary stores. She made certain every gift, every repair payment, every estate disbursement passed through copied ledgers and signed receipts. Theren, swallowing his instinct for immediate defense, backed every measure and placed duplicate estate papers in a locked strongbox witnessed by 2 clerks who disliked Seraphine's brother on principle. Then they waited. Seraphine, believing herself clever, chose the midsummer assembly at Governor Selby's Hall for her strike. It was the largest gathering of the season. Officers in polished boots, merchants scented with money, wives armed with fans and memory, daughters trained to smile while being evaluated like export porcelain. Candlelight turned the long room gold. Music softened the air without redeeming it. Corusand entered beside Theren wearing cream silk trimmed in quiet green, not dazzling enough to look vain, not modest enough to look cowed. She felt the room register them, adjust, and begin its silent arithmetic. Who bowed? Who hesitated? Who watched for fracture? Seraphine approached before the second set of dances had ended. "My dear Duchess," she said, sweet as a sugared blade, "how relieved you must be to appear among friends when the county has been so anxious over the chapel silver and certain vanished drafts." Conversation thinned around them in immediate hunger. Theron's hand shifted fractionally at Coruscant's back. She could feel his restraint like held thunder. Coruscant looked at Seraphine with grave courtesy. "How kind of you to mention matters that exist nowhere except in gossip." Seraphine smiled wider. "Gossip often begins where smoke suggests a fire." "Indeed," said Lady Honora, materializing at Coruscant's left as if conjured by insolence. "And sometimes smoke turns out to be powder from a lady's own cosmetic box." A few people laughed. Seraphine did not. She had committed now. Pride would not let her retreat. "Then perhaps," she said more sharply, "your grace will deny that estate monies were diverted through the dairy accounts under your direction." There it was. The accusation she thought sounded technical enough to frighten men and specific enough to stain. Coruscant had imagined many versions of this moment. In none of them did she wish to tremble. She did not. Not because she lacked fear, but because the last 6 months had altered fear into something more serviceable. "I will do better than deny it," she said. "I will explain it." The room stilled. She drew from her reticule not a handkerchief, as several women clearly expected, but 3 folded papers tied with green ribbon. The dairy wages funded mending work approved under household economy, signed by the steward, witnessed by Mrs. Bell, and paid from my marriage settlement allowance, not from estate principal. She handed one sheet to Governor Selby's wife, another to the minister, and the third to magistrate Reeves, who had been pretending all evening not to hope for entertainment. As for the chapel silver, it was found yesterday exactly where Mrs. Darnley left it after inventory, which she has already stated in writing. The so-called vanished drafts are in the Ashcombe strongbox, together with copies made before witnesses in anticipation of this very accusation. Seraphine's color changed. Only slightly. But high society feeds on slight changes the way hounds take scent. "You anticipated me," she said. Coruscant held her gaze. "No. I anticipated malice from someone who mistakes my family's old disgrace for a permanent right to insult me." The sentence landed harder than a shout would have done. Theren stepped forward then, not to overshadow her, but to widen the ring of consequence. "Lady Seraphine," he said with lethal calm, "if you have documentary proof against my wife, present it now. If not, understand that every repetition of this slander from this moment forward will be treated as deliberate falsehood." Seraphine looked about for rescue and found only curiosity curdling into distance. People enjoy scandal best when it does not threaten to become measurable. Honora, who believed mercy should occasionally be educational, added, "You have been eager to weaponize the Duchess's past. Shall we also discuss your brother's warehouse notes in Norfolk, or is tonight reserved only for other families' embarrassments?" Seraphine went white. She had not known Honora knew. That was the moment the room turned. Not loudly, no crowd gasped, no one clapped. High society destroys with subtler instruments. A gentleman took one step away from Seraphine as though making room for someone else to join the conversation, and found himself unable to return. A matron who had been all smiles 5 minutes earlier remembered suddenly that she had not greeted the governor's niece. 2 young wives lowered their fans just enough to exchange the satisfied look women share when they have watched another woman reach too greedily for blood and slip in it. Seraphine made the mistake of speaking again. "This is absurd," she said. "Everyone knows what the Wren name means." Corusand answered before Theren could. "Yes," she said. "It means my brother sinned, My father failed to stop him, and I have spent a year being asked to inherit guilt as if it were a dowry. But it also means I did not lie, did not steal, and did not come to Ashcombe to be remade according to other people's contempt. If society requires a woman to stay ruined after the men around her have erred, then society is not guarding virtue. It is only enjoying convenience. No one moved. Then Governor Selby's wife, a woman too seasoned to admire cowardice when it had become obvious, said clearly, "I find that perfectly stated." The spell broke in Coruscant's favor. Seraphine left before the final dance. Theren and Corusand did not. They stood through the set, spoke to everyone they meant to speak to, and departed with the unhurried dignity of people who had learned the peculiar power of not fleeing rooms built to wound them. In the carriage home, silence held for perhaps half a mile. Then Theren caught her hand and lifted it to his mouth. "I have never," he said, voice unsteady in a way she had heard only twice before, "been prouder of another human being." Corusand looked at him in the dark carriage, the candle lantern rocking gold across his face. "For defending myself?" she asked. "For making it impossible for them to reduce you to defense alone." Something inside her, long braced against humiliation, gave way at that. She leaned against him. He held her, not as a duke claiming what was his, but as a man astonished by love and careful with it. By autumn, Seraphine's influence had withered. Her brother's Norfolk papers became uncomfortably public. Her mother spoke often of retiring from society for reasons of health. The tenants of Ashcombe, hearing in their own piecemeal fashion that the Duchess had faced a room full of rank and lived, regarded her thereafter with something beyond gratitude, not merely affection, allegiance. As for Theren, he never again referred to his marriage as an arrangement. Years later, people would tell the story incorrectly. They would say a grieving duke took a scandal-marked wife out of duty and discovered, to everyone's surprise, that she was worthy of love. The telling flattered him and made her sound like a pleasant lesson sent for his improvement. The truer account was less comfortable and far better. A man in grief built walls and called them wisdom. A woman, exiled into silence, refused to become decorative sorrow. She learned the map of an estate no one had invited her to heal, then healed it anyway. In doing so, she changed not only the lives below the hall, but the heart of the man who had mistaken distance for dignity. When society came to use her past against her, she met it not with borrowed rescue, but with evidence, courage, and the hard-earned habit of standing her ground. And Duke Theren, who had once hidden his Duchess in the East Wing to spare himself embarrassment, spent the rest of his life discovering that the finest thing ever brought into Ashcombe Hall had not been peace after grief. It had been Corusand Wren herself, seen at last, and impossible to exile again.